The silence in the apartment was no longer the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other. It had become a heavy, suffocating fog. The mechanical rhythm of the radiator hissed in the background. Elara sat on the velvet sofa, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold porcelain mug. Across the room, Kaito was a silhouette against the harsh glow of his monitors, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with a frantic, mechanical energy. They were physically separated by only a few feet, yet the emotional distance felt like an unbridgeable chasm. This was their routine now, a series of parallel lives characterized by the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Elara allowed her mind to wander back to the beginning, to a time when their world was painted in vibrant hues. The scent of promise was everywhere. She remembered the sun-drenched studio they shared, where the air was thick with the scent of turpentine and espresso. Back then, Kaito would sit on the floor for hours, watching her transform a blank canvas into art. He had been her champion, promising that no matter how high he climbed in the corporate world, he would always protect her spark. They had laughed until their lungs ached, sharing dreams of gallery openings. Those memories felt like fragments of a movie starring someone else, a story that had been cruelly edited. The erosion had been subtle, a slow tide pulling the sand from beneath her feet. She was a spectator to her own decline. As Kaito's career ascended, his world grew larger while Elara's began to shrink. The space once reserved for her easels was gradually overtaken by his mahogany desk and filing cabinets. Her passion for painting was tucked away into drawers, replaced by the mundane demands of domestic life. She became the curator of his comfort, ensuring his suits were pressed while her own ambitions gathered dust. She was supporting his climb to the top, unaware that the higher he went, the less he could see of the woman standing at the base. Indifference is a slow poison. It manifested in the way Kaito stopped noticing the highlights in her hair, or the way he would scroll through his phone while she tried to speak about her day. Dates were forgotten, and eventually he stopped looking at her altogether. He looked through her like she was made of glass. When his eyes did find hers, they were vacant, seeing a provider of services rather than a partner. He looked through her, his mind always racing toward the next promotion. Elara had become a permanent fixture of the house, as reliable and as invisible as the faded wallpaper. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope was white and crisp. Elara had received news that an old sketch had been selected for an exhibition, a small milestone, but one that felt like a spark of her former self. When Kaito returned, she stood in the kitchen, heart pounding. She began to tell him, but he cut her off. He launched into a tirade about his stressful day, dismissing her achievement as a hobby that didn't pay the bills. The rejection was sharp. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elara stood before the mirror, staring at a stranger. The woman looking back had hollow eyes and a spirit ground down to powder. The past called out to her. She realized she had lost her essence in the service of a man who didn't see her. A quiet thought took root. She was more alone in this marriage than she would be by herself. Reaching under the bed, her hand struck a hidden object, her old sketch pad. As she opened the pages, she saw the vibrant girl she used to be. The realization hit her hard. She had been a ghost in her own home, and the haunting had to reach its end. Elara lived the next few days in a strange, suspended animation. She moved through the rooms like a visitor in a museum dedicated to a life she no longer wished to lead. Every object, the heavy drapes, the blender Kaito insisted they buy, felt foreign. She was observing herself from a distance, watching a woman pour coffee and fold laundry with mechanical precision. This waking dream was a necessary shield. It allowed her to weigh the heavy comfort of her current misery against the terrifying, boundless void of the unknown. She realized the walls of this home weren't protecting her. They were keeping the rest of the world out. One evening, the silence became too much to bear. As Kaito sat at the table, his face a mask of focus, Elara sat across from him. She had no plate, only her voice, which felt thin and fragile. She tried to tell him about the hollowness in her chest and how she felt like she was slowly disappearing. She spoke of her loneliness as a plea for a lifeline. Kaito didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his expression was one of profound annoyance. He told her she was being too sensitive and that her dramatic outbursts were a distraction from his work. He suggested she find a simple hobby to occupy her mind. In that moment, the final thread snapped. It wasn't a loud break, but a quiet, cold realization. Elara saw Kaito clearly for the first time in years. He didn't love her. He loved the convenience she provided to his life. He loved the clean shirts, the warm meals, and the fact that someone was waiting in the shadows to validate his existence. She was mere living furniture to him. The pain of this realization was sharp, followed by a crystalline clarity. The guilt that had anchored her for so long simply evaporated, leaving behind a hard, cold resolve. She began her secret preparations with the precision of a ghost. Every morning, after Kaito left for the office, Elara reclaimed a small piece of herself. She spent hours online, searching for coastal studios in a place where the light was bright and the air promised renewal. She found a modest space above a bakery, old but filled with potential. She began to pack in small sentimental increments. A specific book, old sketches, a sweater that still smelled of her own perfume. She hid these items in the back of the closet, tucked away like secrets. On her way home from an errand, she stopped at a small art supply store. The bell above the door chimed like a starting pistol. She walked past the student paints and went straight to the professional section. There, she selected a set of fine sable brushes. Holding them felt like holding a scepter. They were her commitment to her own identity. She was no longer just a shadow in Kaito's house. She was an artist returning to her craft. That night, she hid the brushes in her nightstand, a secret promise of what was to come. Their last dinner was an exercise in atmospheric tension. Kaito ate with his usual efficiency, complaining about his staff. Elara watched him, her heart surprisingly still. The silence was no longer heavy with sadness. It was heavy with the weight of her impending departure. She looked at the man she had once adored and felt a mourning for the person he used to be. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply finished. She answered his questions with polite, "Haswai, poism justice quasi voidlas." Brief sentences, her mind already on the train tracks leading far away. Before the night ended, she took a final walk to the park. She went to the bench where they had once sat until dawn, dreaming of a future together. The park was cold, the trees skeletal against the night sky. She stood there for a long time, saying a silent goodbye to the man she used to know. She acknowledged the girl she had been and promised to take better care of her this time. The park was just a place now, no longer a sanctuary of memories. Returning home, she moved with quiet purpose. She checked her suitcase one last time, ensuring her new brushes were safe. Kaito was already in bed, his breathing deep and rhythmic, undisturbed by the tectonic shift happening in his house. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, her shadow stretching across the floor. She reached out to set her alarm for dawn, the hour of the first train. She watched him sleep in the moonlight, knowing this was the last time she would ever see him in this light. The pre-dawn light filtered through the blinds in thin grayish ribs, casting a skeletal glow over the bedroom. Elara stood by the bed, her breath visible in the morning chill that the heater could never quite defeat. Kaito remained a motionless lump under the heavy duvet, his breathing rhythmic and oblivious. For a fleeting second, a pang of habit tugged at her heart, the urge to wake him, but the feeling vanished, replaced by the weight of the suitcase in her hand. She moved through the hallway like a ghost reclaiming its life, avoiding the creaky floorboards she had navigated for years. In the kitchen, she sat at the small table where they had shared 1,000 silent meals. She pulled out a piece of stationery, her pen poised to explain the years of loneliness and the cold indifference that had pushed her to this precipice. She wanted to tell him how much it hurt to be invisible, but as the ink hovered, she realized she had already given him years of words that never reached him. He didn't need an explanation. He needed her presence for his convenience. Leaving a letter was just another service. Instead, she laid her house key in the center of the table. No words were left. The silence was the only message he would understand. As she stepped over the threshold, the click of the lock behind her sounded like a gunshot in the morning stillness. It wasn't a sound of breaking, but of sealing. Outside, the air was crisp, a sharp reminder that she was alive. With every block she walked toward the station, the invisible chains that had anchored her to that apartment seemed to snap. By the time she reached the platform, An overwhelming lightness had taken hold of her chest. It was the sensation of a person who had finally remembered how to breathe after years underwater. The train ride was a blur of steel. As the locomotive pulled away, Elara watched the skyline, the buildings where Kaito spent his days, shrink into the distance. The urban sprawl eventually gave way to the open horizon of the coast. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't looking at the world through the lens of someone else's expectations. She was just Elara, a woman on a journey toward her own soul, her suitcase packed with nothing but possibilities and her new brushes. Back in the apartment, the sun rose higher, spilling golden light onto the solitary quay. Kaito stirred, the absence of the morning routine finally piercing his sleep. No smell of coffee, no sound of the shower. He called her name, his voice thick with expectation. Silence greeted him. He walked into the kitchen, annoyed at the absence of breakfast, only to find the key. It took several minutes for the reality to settle into his bones. The background noise of his life was gone. The house felt suddenly, terrifyingly cavernous. Elara arrived at her new studio as the afternoon sun hit the old brick walls. The space was modest and chilly, yet it felt more like home than the luxury apartment ever had. With trembling fingers, she unpacked her brushes and set up her easel where the light was purest. Without hesitation, she dipped a brush into vibrant crimson and made the first stroke across the white void of the canvas. It was a bold, messy mark, the first line of a new chapter. She realized then that walking away wasn't an act of defeat, but the ultimate victory. To choose oneself when the world demands you disappear is a quiet revolution. As the sun began to set, casting an amber glow across her new sanctuary, Elara stepped out onto the small balcony. She looked at the horizon, where the sea met the sky. This sunset wasn't a closing curtain. It was the prologue to a story she was finally ready to write. Her fingers were stained with paint, and for the first time in many years, her smile was real.